Foremost, I didn't realize that what you meant by an intimate little gathering would be this. But I'm obviously enormously pleased to be here today and also to see quite a few familiar faces in the audience. 19 years ago, I was sitting where you sit today. Not literally speaking, of course, because the sports center didn't exist, but you get my gist. And since then, I have traveled to and lived in a number of the world's hotspots. Afghanistan, Eastern Congo, South Sudan, Syria, Chad. And at the outset, let me reassure the parents that I'm not here to recruit you to this kind of life. And I promise I won't mention the war. But I am here today to share with you 3 simple pieces of advice that have served me well. Number 1, trust nobody. Number 2, be a home wrecker. I'll get to that in a minute. And number 3, show no sympathy. So, number 1, trust nobody. Let me tell you about a teenage boy named Wally from a remote Afghan mountain village. And at age 16, Wally was offered a scholarship to a boarding school in Jordan, not all that different from Truro School. I accompanied Wally to this new school, to his new life, on his first flight and his first trip outside of his native Afghanistan. So here we were, the teenage boy who was forced to leave behind everything that he knew for a completely and totally new world that was so very different from his own. And I, the seasoned traveler, who was meant to explain this brave new world to him. We had one day for sightseeing, and we chose the Dead Sea. I gave Wally very specific instructions on how to float in the Dead Sea, in particular, not to dive, because as I'm sure you know, because of the high salt concentration in the water, any contact with the eye makes this an extremely painful experience. So Wally looks at me, he nods in agreement and he says, "Yes, Miss Connie." That's a form of address of respect for Afghan teachers. Then off he goes, and the next thing I hear is this loud splash as Wally dives in head first into the sea, only to come out again seconds later, screaming and crying and rubbing his eyes and sort of hobbling out of the water half blind. And when I say to him, "Wally, why didn't you listen to what I told you?" he said, giving me this glorious smile whilst still crying. He says, "Well, Miss Connie, somebody told me that you couldn't drown in the Dead Sea. And I just had to try to see if that was true. I just had to try to see if that was true." Wally was so right not to take my word for it. There might be, of course, the more obvious global fallacies that have already been tested and proven wrong by people cleverer than us, such as the world is flat, or all Muslims are terrorists, or the French can beat the Germans in the World Cup. But beyond that, people everywhere will be trying to tell you what is right and what is wrong. They will be presenting opinions as statements of fact. But as you venture out into the world, I encourage you not to take anybody's word for it, not to just trust everything that you hear. Make up your own mind and make your own mistakes. Finding the truth for yourself, well, it might sting, but as you come out of the water, ultimately you will be seeing that much more clearly. Which brings me to advice number 2. Be a home wrecker. Since leaving Truro School in 1995, I have lived in 12 countries outside of the UK and visited many more. The reason I have always been able to travel, and quite happily so, is because I always knew where I belonged. But let me clarify this. By belonging, I don't necessarily mean a place, or necessarily one place. In fact, one of the questions that I dread most is the famous, "So, where are you from?" and its sister, the innocuous, "What do you do?" Because, quite honestly, having to respond to that question with having to say, "I am German, I'm a lawyer," well, it's quite possibly amongst the worst conversation killers you can come up with. People tend to put you in compartments immediately. They start speaking slowly and explain their jokes and hide their wallets and that kind of thing. And so, whilst my trying to pass myself off as a Cornish lass over the years has been rather unsuccessful, it is true that a part of me will always belong to Truro School, my very first home away from home. It belongs to my friend Jemima, who sits in the audience today, a fellow boarder at Malvern who travelled with me in my gap year. Because I can tell you that not even boarding school is as much of a bonding experience as sharing bowel problems in a strange land. Sorry about that. A part of me belongs to my friend Pippa, the very first person I ever met at Truro School, and the person who taught me to pronounce properly how to say whiskey and vodka instead of whiskey and vodka. And even though Pippa has been living in New Zealand for the last couple of years, I'm so excited to see her parents here today. And a big part of me belongs to my friend Bobby, who's also sitting in the audience today, all the way from Lagos, Nigeria. And in fact, it was Bobby who was the first person to teach me how to deal with being the only foreigner in a small mountain village in Mexico during my gap year, by showing me how she dealt with being the only black girl in a school in rural Cornwall in the 90s. And on a side note, let me tell you that even 19 years later, crossing the Tamar Bridge still gives my heart that little familiar leap associated with coming home. The trouble with moving around so much is that you leave parts of yourself, as cliched as that sounds, your heart and your soul, in different places around the world. This can be a deeply saddening experience, much like a continuous feeling of loss, because you know that you can never be with everybody you love at the same time. And with every new experience that you make, it takes you that little further away from the people who've stayed behind. But beyond anything else, leaving your home and the places you know so well is a deeply enriching experience. You leave one home, but you construct another. And you leave old friends, but you make new friends. So you broaden your horizons, and you learn to understand. And you can always choose to return. And maybe you'll no longer be Cornelia from Germany. You might be Connie from Europe, or you might be Miss Connie from Afghanistan. You might no longer be merely a lawyer, but a humanitarian and an academic and an editor, whatever you choose. So I want you to destroy in your head the traditional notion of what is home and the traditional idea of who you are. Transcend to a new kind of home. A home that doesn't tie you down to one specific category or to one specific identity. So be a home wrecker. and construct instead a host of new hopes and identities. Break your heart into pieces and plant those in different people and different places. Because remember, home isn't necessarily a place, but it is always an ever-changing experience of belonging and of knowing who you are and who you want to be. And this brings me to my third insight that I wanted to share with you. Show no sympathy. In my job, people always expect me to have lots of sympathy. With refugees, with victims of sexual violence, with victims of war. But truth be told, showing sympathy, feeling sorry for them, well, that doesn't really help anybody, and in fact, it can be rather condescending. And this is the lesson that can be transferred to all of you too. Now, of course, I don't want you to be indifferent and hostile as you go out into the world. But what I mean is, instead of showing sympathy, show empathy. Show empathy, because empathy is actually the #1 skill that will help you understand the world above any technical skills, above any degrees or qualifications. The ability to listen, the ability to observe, and the ability to understand others. Now, one area of expertise in which I have been developing a great deal of empathy is with teenage Afghan girls. Because 4 years ago, I became involved with the School of Leadership Afghanistan, short SOLA. And in a moment of serendipity, my involvement with SOLA has led to the intertwining of my life, not just with an Afghan teenage girl who has since become a part of my family, but also with a former Truro School friend whom I hadn't been in touch with in almost a decade. Farhnaz was an Afghan girl who had received a scholarship to a prestigious US school, but she had had her visa refused by the consulate for arbitrary reasons. Now, I'd like you to put yourself in her shoes for just a second. Here's a girl that has a bright future in her reach after years of hard struggle, only to then have that snapped away from her by a bureaucrat. So, in desperation, everybody at SOLA tried to reach out to anybody who might help. And in my case, the only person I knew involved in education was my old Truro School friend Demelza, with whom I had shared many French and Spanish lessons in Mr. Hunt's class some 16 years before. And Demelza jumped at the opportunity to help Farhnaz apply for a scholarship at a school in Wiltshire, and she eventually became Farhnaz's host mother, and our lives have changed as a result. But I want to tell you a little more about Farhnaz and about empathy. Farhnaz had always been an ace in math, but when she first moved to the UK, she simply could not do the exam questions. And I want to read you one of the questions that really stumped her. Calculate the horizontal length of ground under an alpine ski ramp. Now, I don't know if you can imagine what kind of problems Farhnaz was facing here. Because the school originally could simply not imagine that the word horizontal did not translate easily into Dari. That a 17-year-old might never have heard of the Alps. And that somebody from a country with lots of snow would never have heard of or seen a ski ramp. But don't think that this only cuts one way. When you go out there into the world, half of the time it'll be you not understanding what on earth is going on around you and hoping desperately that somebody will show you some empathy. I still shed tears of embarrassment when I remember how I was sitting in a high-profile meeting with Afghan ministers in Kabul with a dreadful cold. So I was blowing my nose loudly and repeatedly, only to find out afterwards that in Afghanistan, blowing my nose in public in those circumstances was essentially considered as inappropriate as if I'd been publicly passing wind, repeatedly, in front of the Prime Minister. So, the problem is not having cultural mishaps like that. The problem is not noticing. And you will only notice if you listen and watch and ask the right questions and try to understand the very essence of empathy. So to conclude, here are the 3 things that I want you to do when you leave Truro School today, and I'm addressing the Truro School leavers here in particular. When you leave and explore that brave new world out there, seek your own truth, always. Break your heart into pieces and plant it in different places as you are building your expanded home and identity. And lastly, learn to truly understand the feelings of others by going out there with open eyes and an open mind. And so I would like to, I don't know where they all are, but I would like to have the leavers amongst you stand up for a second, please. So I would like you to take a look around and look at your friends for a second, and to look at your families. And I want you to remember this day, because no matter whether you stay in Cornwall or whether you choose to travel in the UK or in the world, remember that this day today, this is where it starts, the rest of your lives. Congratulations.